Thank you, Trevor. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for inviting me, and I want to thank each of you for coming. While whether to increase fuel taxes is near the top of Congress's agenda, now is a good time to discuss the bigger picture of how the federal government funds surface transportation. The purpose of this talk is to propose a way to reform surface transportation funding. It's not a quick fix, but involves a long-term change in the way highways are funded that will enhance the functioning of our transportation system. Although I'm not going to say much about reducing the role of the federal government in highway funding, the method of funding I'm going to propose could be handled as well or better by state governments, local governments, or even private firms, though assistance from the federal government could be important for the transition. My talk will be divided into three parts. First, I'll discuss the basics of transportation funding, focusing on historical factors. Next, I talk about areas where improvement is needed. And last, I will talk about options for reform with details about the ramifications of those reforms. So first, let's talk about the basics of transportation funding. My focus will be on highways and the Highway Trust Fund. I consider public transportation only as much as it receives revenue from the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund was created in 1956 as a way for drivers to pay for the construction of the interstate highway system and other primary and secondary roads of national importance by means of fuel taxes. It was pay-as-you-go. By pay-as-you-go, I mean the money from the Highway Trust Fund was limited to paying for highways, and the total amount the federal government was making available to pay for highways was limited to the money that was in the Highway Trust Fund. Federal Highway Trust Fund money is given as matching grants to the states according to a formula that determines what percentage each state gets back of the money paid in. States then manage the actual process of construction and maintenance, combining federal funds with state and sometimes local funds. Beginning in 1982, about 1/9 of the money in the Highway Trust Fund was used for public transportation and transferred to what was then called or created as the transit account of the Highway Trust Fund. This amount has increased until almost 20% of federal Highway Trust Fund spending now goes for public transportation. The range of projects supported by the Trust Fund has expanded to include bike paths, recreational trails, safety improvements, and a few other things. Since 1993, the federal tax rate has been constant at 18.4 cents per gallon for gasoline and 22.4 cents per gallon of diesel fuel. Those federal taxes are then combined with whatever the state or the state tax rate is for gasoline. So while we've had constant tax rates at the federal level, the costs have risen due to inflation, so that revenues have not kept up with costs. Revenues have not even kept up with miles driven, as auto fuel efficiency has increased so that drivers pay less in fuel taxes per mile that they drive. For many years, fuel tax revenue exceeded spending out of the trust fund. In the 1990s, there were some years where my understanding is that some of the excess fuel tax revenue actually went for deficit reduction. Since 2008, the trust fund has spent considerably more than what was collected in fuel taxes. Between 2008 and 2014, somewhere in the neighborhood of $65 billion has been transferred from the general fund to the Highway Trust Fund. We cannot afford to use general fund money for highways. The federal government is going to have a harder and harder time meeting its other obligations out of the general fund, particularly the rising costs of Social Security and Medicare. So the idea of having a separate source of funding for highways makes sense, as it did in the past when the Highway Trust Fund was set up. Second thing that I want to look at is areas for improvement. The problem with the current system is the disconnect between revenues generated and overall system performance. One way the system can be improved is to reduce congestion. Drivers put much more strain on the highway system if they drive during peak hours. Congestion is very serious and has grown more serious over the years. In 1982, Los Angeles was the only U.S. metropolitan area where the average driver was delayed 40 or more hours per year due to congestion. By 2005, commuters lost an average of 40 or more hours per year to congestion in 28 different U.S. metropolitan areas. The average hours lost due to congestion is about 38 hours. Congestion is particularly costly for long-distance truckers. Trucking companies lose millions of dollars due to the extra time it takes to make deliveries. One big problem is changing shifts. If a truck encounters unexpected congestion, it might not reach its destination before a driver's shift ends, which could then multiply the extra hours required to deliver a product. So how does the current system deal with congestion? It does so in two major ways. First, by widening freeways, but this is very expensive. It means more empty pavement during off-peak hours. When additional lanes are added, rush hour traffic soon grows to use the additional capacity during rush hour. So widening freeways doesn't work very well. The second way of dealing with congestion is encouraging people to use mass transit. But this doesn't work very well either. As of 2009, New York City is the only U.S. city where more than 15% of the population uses public transportation to commute to work. For the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. combined, only about 5% of the population uses public transportation. In spite of billions invested in public transportation, including money spent on new light rail systems and new subway systems, the percentage using mass transit has not increased much, if at all, in the last 10 or 20 years. There is one bright spot, and that is high occupancy vehicle lanes, high occupancy toll lanes do provide a congestion-free option in some cities. The second area for improvement is making better decisions about how to allocate funds within and between states. In the current system, when drivers pay fuel taxes at the pump, that money goes to fuel distributors who then pay it to the government, the state, or the federal government. So payment of fuel taxes is not connected to specific roads or even specific areas of each state where most of the driving occurs. Drivers pay fuel taxes regardless of where they may drive. That is, not all the roads that drivers drive on. For example, if you drive on city streets, the chances are good that those are not paid for by fuel taxes. People who drive on private property are not driving on surfaces paid for by fuel taxes. So some of the money paid in fuel taxes is not really even connected to whether or not people use the services that fuel taxes pay for. How federal tax money is spent is political and not based on economic criteria of benefits versus costs. But when you use something like a gas tax, there is no good way to determine how much more some states should get than what they pay in, or how much less some states should get than what they pay in. There's no good way with taxes other than political to decide the allocation. Likewise, methods for allocating money within states also reflect politics and not costs and benefits. And again, with a fuel tax, there's no good way to say, well, how much should go to rural areas versus urban areas, and so on. Some people say that rural interstates get too much money compared to what urban highways get, but that's not necessarily the case. Rural residents don't get any benefits from trust fund money that's spent on public transit in urban areas, or at least they don't get much, except when people like me travel to Washington, D.C. and use the metro, I guess. In any case, the inequity between states is fairly sharp. Between 1956 and 2010, the state of South Carolina received 83.6% of the money that its residents paid in federal fuel taxes. Alaska, on the other hand, received approximately 6 times the amount of money that its residents paid in fuel taxes for highways and transportation in Alaska. States in the South and Midwest generally get back less than what they pay in, while residents of western states pay in less than what they get back in fuel tax revenue for highways in their states. The third area for improvement is more efficient maintenance of pavement. Too many highways are poorly maintained. One estimate is that the annual costs of damage to vehicles from roads in poor condition is $67 billion per year, which amounts to $324 per driver. In some cities, it's likely twice that much. Keeping up with maintenance is very costly. A trade-off exists between adding new capacity and maintaining existing capacity. Some critics argue that there's what might be called a ribbon-cutting bias, a bias in favor of building new highways or adding new lanes as compared to maintaining existing highways. I'm not sure that there's any good way to determine whether that's the case, again, because it's a political process that varies from one state to the next. In any case, maintenance costs could be reduced if costs were allocated to vehicles in proportion to the damage they cause. Heavy trucks cause far more damage than cars, and they cause more damage traveling slowly on congested highways than they do at highway speeds. One way to improve cost allocation is to charge trucks based on their weight per axle, so that trucks with more axles, which cause less road damage, pay less for each mile that they drive. The third thing that I want to look at is reform options. I'm going to consider 3 reform options: tolling, public-private partnerships, and charging drivers for vehicle miles traveled. But first, I want to emphasize that some method of directly charging people for when and where they drive is a vital part of reform. So how can market prices improve our highway system? Well, as you can see on the chart, even in cities where lanes have been added, demand has grown faster than supply. You can see that in the cities where demand has grown fastest, congestion has increased by close to 200%. But even in the cities where demand has grown relatively slowly and supply of new road capacity has almost kept up, congestion has increased quite a bit. So the problem is the Federal Highway Administration has not been able to keep up with the growth in traffic by adding new lanes in almost any city in the U.S. Something more needs to be done, and that something more is to raise prices during congested periods. Demand for highway capacity exceeds supply during congested periods. Higher prices charged directly for using highways during congested periods would reduce or could eliminate congestion. In particular, congestion prices give people an incentive to use transit instead of driving. With congestion prices, people would be willing to pay more to use transit, so the subsidies, which are quite large to transit, could be reduced, saving the government money. Congestion prices would give people incentives to drive more during off-peak periods and less during peak periods. Revenue collected from congestion prices gives information on how much consumers value a particular highway. Market prices also give incentives to live closer to work. If you compare market prices versus using the approach of subsidizing transit to reduce congestion, subsidizing transit actually gives people incentives to live further from work, especially when you subsidize light rail and rail lines that go out to the suburbs. The Federal Highway Administration in 2011 estimated that widespread congestion pricing could reduce by nearly 1/3 the investment needed to sustain the operational performance of the highway system. If prices reflected damage caused to pavement and stress on bridges, then trucks would find ways to distribute their weight better, such as more axles or use alternate routes. Higher costs for heavy trucks might encourage more shipping by rail or greater reliance on local suppliers for the heaviest loads. So the next question then is, well, okay, so if pricing is a good idea, how to implement pricing? And as I mentioned, there are basically three alternatives, and those three alternatives are tolls. Public-private partnerships was really just another way of implementing tolls, and charging people for vehicle miles traveled. So consider the first approach then, which is to charge tolls on selected highways. Tolls are an important source of additional revenue to help pay for highways. Tolls can be varied by time of day to eliminate congestion. For example, State Highway 91 in California, which has express toll lanes, on that highway, tolls vary from 14.5 cents per mile at night to just under $1 per mile during evening rush hour. And during evening rush hour, congestion on the express lanes is not a problem on a typical day. I imagine there are other places that have done similar things, though I'm less familiar with other examples. Besides tolls, some evidence suggests that private firms may be able to manage highways more efficiently. Thus, we see a growing movement towards states leasing their highways to private firms, and then the private firms are responsible for deciding how much to charge and for managing those highways, usually subject to state guidelines and perhaps some federal guidelines. Tolls in public-private partnerships, however, have two major flaws. Whether government or private firms implement tolls, tolls on selected highways encourage traffic diversion to parallel routes without tolls. Often the parallel routes without tolls are less able to safely accommodate heavy traffic trying to travel at highway speeds. Those parallel routes may go through residential areas, and they then bring noise, additional noise, pollution, and so on to those areas. The second problem with tolling, or whether it's with public-private partnerships or the government, is that tolling selected highways is perceived as unfair, particularly if toll is applied to a highway that was once free. Drivers ask the question, why should I be paying twice to use this highway? I'm already paying for it with fuel taxes. Why should I also pay tolls on top of the fuel taxes? And likewise, since you're going to, at most tolls apply to selected highways, drivers will also say, well, you know, the highway that I drive on has a toll. The highway on the other side of the city or in the next city down the way doesn't have a toll. Why should I pay toll and the drivers on the other highway not pay toll when both of these highways were funded with federal and state fuel tax money? Which brings us to the final alternative, which is vehicle mile travel charges, which is a better way to charge for the use of highways. Vehicle mile travel charges eliminate the unfairness in traffic diversion, or could eliminate the unfairness in traffic diversion resulting from selectively imposing tolls. Vehicle mile travel charges, which I'll also refer to as mileage-based user fees, require, or would work best with an onboard unit in the vehicle that records how many miles the vehicle travels. Mileage-based user fees can be comprehensive, applying to all roads and highways. For that reason, they could replace fuel taxes. Instead of another tax or an additional charge that's added to the fuel tax, vehicle mile travel charges is actually an alternative way for highways. It's a new way, if you will, of paying for highways. The ideal approach would be to vary charges by time and location of travel, which is certainly reasonably doable with existing technology. Vehicle mile travel charges can be used to provide signals as to which roads have enough demand to expand cost effectively. Like any other method of pricing, mileage-based user fees give people an incentive to use alternatives, whether it's take transit, live closer to work, or drive at different times of the day when prices are lower because of less congestion. Now, someone might ask, since my talk is focused largely on urban problems, well, what about rural areas? Well, in rural areas, especially rural areas that have highways that are fairly well traveled, drivers might very well pay less than on some urban interstates due to lower congestion. Prices may need to be higher on some lightly traveled rural highways to generate enough revenue to cover the costs of maintenance. With vehicle miles travel charges, highways could be managed by state highway departments, local governments, or private firms, and it could be different from one highway to the next. There's no reason for the federal government to be involved except, perhaps, to expedite a transition from the existing system to a new system like that. Vehicle mile travel charges have been pilot tested in several states. They've been pilot tested in Oregon and small pilot test in Minnesota and a few other states in the past, and there is either ongoing or soon to be started another pilot test in Oregon, and California has plans also to pilot test vehicle mile travel charges. Mileage-based user fees, such as vehicle mile travel charges, raise practical concerns. First is the cost of transition. If you were going to say, well, we want to have a vehicle mile travel charges in a year, then you'd have to deal with the cost of installing some kind of a device in each and every automobile to be able to record miles traveled, which would be costly to do. So a better way to move to vehicle miles travel charges is to do it gradually, to require the devices to be installed in new vehicles, which would mean then a transition which could take 15 to 20 years in terms of how long it takes for the existing stock of vehicles to turn over and be replaced by new ones. The second practical concern is that of equity. That is, what about the effect on low-income drivers, low-income commuters? Some research suggests that the way the costs of mileage-based user fees would vary with income would be very similar to how fuel taxes vary with income. There's no reason why the total cost to drivers of mileage-based user fees need be any higher than the total cost of fuel taxes. While they may vary differently in terms of different times of day, the total cost to the average driver shouldn't be any higher, and thus no particular reason to expect that low-income drivers would end up paying more than they do now under fuel taxes. A couple of other ways that low-income drivers might actually benefit. Number one, low-income drivers probably drive vehicles that are less fuel efficient, which means they pay more in fuel taxes for each mile that they drive than others do, and vehicle mile travel charges will equalize that. Also, low-income people may benefit if mileage-based user fees result in more compact cities with jobs located closer to people's homes. The biggest practical concern about vehicle mile travel charges, the one that I presume some of you have already started to think about, is the privacy concern, the idea that when you have a device in your vehicle recording where you drive and when you drive, that information, especially if it's managed by a government, is not necessarily things that people want a government agency to be able to track so easily. And privacy concerns can be addressed in several ways. First, how the charges are calculated and communicated. One alternative is to record all the information inside the vehicle and report only the amount due to the agency responsible for receiving payment. So inside the vehicle, the location, the time of travel is recorded, but then inside the vehicle also the charge is recorded, and the charge is the only thing that gets communicated to whoever is responsible for receiving and payment and collecting it. Another way to deal with privacy concerns is to allow voluntary transition. That is, to give people the option of continuing to pay gas taxes, or if they prefer, paying vehicle mile travel charges instead. which, by the way, people conceivably could also get discounts on their auto insurance if they paid that in a way that's connected to their mileage traveled. A third way to deal with privacy concerns is to recognize the fact that if there's a gradual transition, there ought to be an opportunity for feedback from drivers to communicate to those in charge how to improve the process, better encryption, and so on, addressing concerns that might arise during the period of transition. Vehicle mile travel charges, particularly during the transition period, could be combined with tolling. For example, using tolls as an additional charge on express lanes or on new highways, as is currently being done, might make sense, especially during the period when some people are still paying gas taxes. In conclusion, voters are more reluctant than ever to support tax increases. Because people value the services provided by highways and transit systems, requiring them to pay for each trip makes sense, even if the resulting cost of some trips is considerably higher than what they pay now. Like any other service, people have the choice to pay, go without, or find a less costly alternative. The closer prices charged are to being market determined rather than being set by some politically devised formula, the better. Since vehicle mile travel charges could be tied to particular roads, they could be managed by state or local governments or private firms instead of the federal government. Prices charged for vehicle miles traveled would give drivers the opportunity to reveal how much they value particular routes at particular times of the day. Since their time is valuable, many drivers would be willing to pay more to drive on an uncongested highway. Those who don't value reduced congestion enough to pay for it may adjust their time of travel, take fewer trips, share rides, or choose a different mode of travel, such as public transportation. Revenue earned from prices would give drivers or give highway managers signals about whether they can expect to earn enough revenue to cover the costs of adding lanes and when there's enough demand to make it worthwhile to add lanes. With pricing, the quality and capacity of roads will reflect drivers' willingness to pay rather than political considerations. As a result, problems of persistent congestion or inadequate maintenance could be reduced or eliminated. Thank you for your attention.